So, the video I put out last month in defence of David Lynch's, in my opinion, much unfairly maligned movie of Frank Herbert's Dune, went over really rather well and sparked a lot of conversation. And it's got me to wondering if perhaps some of my other, shall we say, outlying opinions are also more commonly held than I'd believed. So with that in mind, here are my 5 most heretical opinions. By which I just mean my heretical pop culture opinions. I've got some properly heretical ones as well. Number 1. The first series of Blackadder was the best. Now, in every kind of retrospective of Blackadder I ever see, the first series is either omitted completely, as was the case with the Christmas show, or is kind of quickly brushed aside as some kind of unmentionable embarrassment. Why is this? Now, I get that in many ways it's a bit of an outlier. It's different from the other 3 series. But for my mind, all the ways it's different to the other 3 series are what makes it great. When Blackadder 2 started in early 1986, which was a good 2.5 years after Series 1, I remember being kind of disappointed that it was much more of a typical sitcom than Series 1. Everything's shot on these tight little 3-walled sets. There is, as I recall, precisely 1 scene shot on location in the whole of Series 2. Whereas Series 1 had a real kind of grandeur to it. It wasn't shot to look like a sitcom, it was shot to look like a Sunday classic serial or a Shakespeare adaptation. They had these big sets, lots of it was shot on location. Now, I get that visual scope and grandeur doesn't actually make something funnier, but it did provide a nice little counterpoint. You had the nicely jarring contrast between the sumptuous visuals and the scabrousness of the subject matter. It's also the only series that really gets its money's worth out of Rowan Atkinson. Rowan Atkinson is, of course, a ridiculously gifted comic actor, but his specific talent is for playing these sort of snivelling grotesques. And that's what he plays in Series 1. From Series 2 onwards, he's the cool, good-looking, clever one. Now, okay, he pulls off being the cool, good-looking, clever one, but why would you waste Rowan Atkinson on the cool, good-looking, clever character? I mean, don't get me wrong, I was overjoyed when it came back, and I loved Season 2, and I loved all the subsequent seasons. Even if Season 2 does plant the seeds of what would ultimately become some quite bad habits in the writing. That's the most overextended, double-ended simile since Mr. Overextended cracked an enormous double-ended simile. And Series 1's got Brian Blessed in it. How can the version of anything with Brian Blessed in possibly not be the best one? Number 2, the original 1982 theatrical cut of Blade Runner is the only one that's any good. Now, those of you who know me were probably waiting for this one to come up. I have written at length on this topic. I'll put a link in the description to a lengthy article I wrote about this. But the original 1982 theatrical cut of Blade Runner, which thankfully is actually slightly easier to find now than it was about 10 years ago, is the only one that makes any sense and is the only one that's actually about anything. Because it's the only version which hasn't had the unicorn dream sequence ham-fistedly sellotaped into the middle of it, thus engendering the utterly pointless, oh, what if Harrison Ford's a replicant as well subplot. Which makes no sense whatsoever as a plot device and it completely eviscerates the film thematically. It's important to understand that that wasn't a restoration. That wasn't something that was cut from the original for time. This is a plot point that was bolted onto the movie 10 years after the fact. It wasn't in the script. It wasn't in anybody's mind when they were actually making the movie. It was just bunged in 10 years later, and it's bullshit.
Excuse me, but Ridley Scott stated quite clearly that it...
Fuck off, I don't care what Ridley Scott said. Once you put a bit of art out there, you are no longer the sole authority on what it means. And besides, if Ridley Scott is to be treated as the sole authority on what his films are all about, how did he make the second and third worst Alien sequels? Yeah, I said it. Prometheus and Covenant are both worse than Alien Resurrection. You can have that bit of heresy for free. Number 3, Pete and Dud were funnier than Derek and Clive. Discovering Derek and Clive was kind of a rite of passage for boys, I think, of my generation. It could be that some of you have no idea what any of this is about. Back in the 60s, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore made a TV show called Not Only But Also, and one of the running sketches on this show were long rambly dialogues between their comic alter egos Pete and Dud, who are these two sort of lonely weirdos in Macintoshes and flat caps, who every week would just kind of drone on at each other on a given topic. And these dialogues are brilliant, as is often the case with BBC shows from the 60s. Not that many of them still exist in their original form, but you can hear audio recordings of pretty much all of them. Now, in the 70s, and increasingly disillusioned with each other, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore were on tour in America, and in an attempt to try and recapture some of the old Pete and Dud magic, they booked themselves into a recording studio, therein to improvise some Pete and Dud-esque dialogues. But because of the copious amounts of alcohol involved and because they didn't think anybody was ever going to get to hear this, it went off in some incredibly scatological and just plain nasty directions. When these tapes surfaced in due course, they found that these new comic alter egos, Derek and Clive, who were just kind of a much nastier, swearier version of Pete and Dud, became kind of countercultural heroes in the then burgeoning punk scene, and consequently they went back into the studio to record some more Derek and Clive stuff, this time starting nasty and getting nastier. So yeah, the Derek and Clive stuff is way edgier than the Pete and Dud stuff. It's way more transgressive than the Pete and Dud stuff. But what it only very occasionally is anything like as funny as the Pete and Dud stuff. And also, it's not always transgressive in a particularly nice way. A lot of it's like really misogynistic. And Peter Cook in particular is obviously in a really dark place. And a lot of it is him just really giving vent to all his hatred. So yeah, listen to Derek and Clive if you want to be shock rigid, but if you actually want to laugh occasionally, listen to Pete and Dud. Number 4, George Lazenby was perfectly okay as James Bond. I may do a whole video about this one day. When I was a kid, the general consensus of opinion appeared to be that On Her Majesty's Secret Service is the worst Bond movie because George Lazenby was shit as James Bond. It subsequently seemed to go something of a reappraisal, and in particular it was championed by the Ian Fleming purists because it sticks very close to the book. And in due course, the general consensus appeared to be On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a brilliant James Bond movie and would be the best James Bond movie were it not for the fact that George Lazenby is shit as James Bond. Now, I've rewatched it a couple of times recently, and I'm here to say that you're all wrong. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is all over the fucking place as a movie, and George Lazenby is the least of its problems. He's perfectly okay as James Bond. He's just trying to be James Bond under almost impossible circumstances in a really weird movie. Now, yes, he is a bit wooden, but you know, so's Roger Moore. Now, George Lazenby doesn't have anything like Roger Moore's charm and charisma, so he can't really pull off being wooden quite as successfully as Roger did. But he does an amazing job considering A, he had no acting experience at the time. He was just a good-looking guy who'd done a chocolate commercial. That's literally all he was. And B, the whole movie seems to be conspiring against giving him a chance to do a proper James Bond performance. It's perhaps unfortunate that the first movie in which James Bond is played by somebody other than Sean Connery is also the first movie in which James Bond kind of acts out of character. They also take the really bizarre decision of, for the 15 minutes or so in the middle of the film in which he's pretending to be a character played by George Baker, having him dubbed by George Baker. Now, when you're going undercover somewhere where you've never been before, pretending to be somebody who these people have never met, why would you need to do the voice? He's also dressed rather weirdly. They give him this strange sort of dandified wardrobe. Okay, he wears a tux, but under his tux he wears a frill-fronted translucent shirt. There's a scene where he goes horse riding and he's wearing a kind of comedy gaucho costume. James Bond is a snappy but conservative dresser. He's not a dandy. He's not Austin Powers. And while it is true that the film does stick extremely closely to the book, that doesn't in and of itself make a good film. It also means that it doesn't really sit in the continuity of the films that they're trying to establish. In the book of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, James Bond meets Blofeld for the first time, and they're kind of dancing around each other for a few days before either one admits to knowing who the other one is. And that's how they play it in the movie as well, despite the fact that James Bond and Blofeld already met each other in the previous film. The fact that they're both now played by different actors doesn't actually change this. And yet elsewhere in the film there it pains to point out that this is still the same James Bond and this does follow on from the previous movies. There's a scene where Bond has to clear out his desk and it's full of mementos from all the previous movies, the discovery of which is illustrated from a musical sting from the movie in question. So this obviously is meant to follow on from the previous films, it just kind of doesn't. It's also a myth that George Lazenby was fired after one movie because he was shit. He quit because he hadn't enjoyed it. He found the whole experience to be incredibly grim, apparently. And also, in the final scene of the movie, George has to play one of the literally 4 or 5 scenes in the entire history of the Bond franchise where James Bond actually has to show some emotion. And he nails it. He does it brilliantly. So yeah, George Lazenby was a perfectly okay James Bond. He was a very good James Bond under the circumstance, and it's just a shame that we didn't get to see how good of a James Bond he might have ultimately become. All right, here we go. Here's the last one. This is the big one. This is the one which has cost me friendships. Fawlty Towers isn't funny. It's not. Now, I get that all humour is subjective, and this possibly says more things about me being weird than it says about Fawlty Towers being good or bad, but Fawlty Towers doesn't make me laugh. I can appreciate the work that's gone into it. I can see the meticulousness with which it's constructed. It's perfectly put together. It's like a Swiss watch. But there's nothing inherently funny about a Swiss watch. Well, I guess it would depend what you did with it. So I can marvel at the skill that's gone into constructing it, But I've seen all 12 episodes many, many times. Seriously, our Astrid loves it and watches it on Netflix on a loop. And I can honestly say that it just doesn't make me laugh, with one exception. There's one line that makes me howl, and it's this.
Will you stop talking about the war?
Me? You started it?
We did not start it.
Yes, you did. You invaded Poland.
All right, fair play to you, Mr. Cleese. I can't take it away from you. That's genius. But the rest of it seems to be predicated on the idea that embarrassment is funny. Embarrassment isn't funny. It's just embarrassing. I've been embarrassed many times. There's nothing remotely funny about it. I don't find other people's embarrassment funny. And if you don't find embarrassment funny, there's really not a hell of a lot to laugh at in Fawlty Towers. Apart from the occasional bit of slapstick, and they often seem to just kind of come out of nowhere as well. Now, again, I am willing to accept that this could be me being weird. As I've discussed elsewhere, I've never actually been properly tested or diagnosed, but there is a reasonable chance that I'm somewhere on the autistic spectrum. And it could well be that this is just a whole field of humour that's just completely lost on me. Maybe neurotypical people think being mortally embarrassed is the funniest thing imaginable. So yeah, massive Cleese fan, massive Python fan. Fawlty Towers just leaves me utterly cold. And yet every time there's a poll of the funniest sitcoms ever, it wins. I've almost never heard this opinion of it expressed anywhere else. I am aware that this means a lot of you are never going to speak to me again. So there you go. Those are my 5 most heretical pop culture opinions. I've no doubt plenty of you are going to have some things to say about this. Please say them in the comments below. And yeah, what are your most heretical opinions? What are the things that you think that apparently nobody else does? I'd be very keen to hear those too. All right, see you soon. Bye-bye.
This video was made possible by the supporters of my Patreon project, who help me make fun things while receiving great perks and rewards. If you enjoyed it, why not follow the link and join us?